A plane is losing control over Paris. If they crash, the death toll would be in the thousands, and it would become one of the deadliest disasters Europe has ever seen. It's a Boeing 777. Given Boeing's reputation, it's supposedly one of the safest aircraft in the world. But now, something has gone seriously wrong, and the plane is doing things that the pilots don't understand, and they're losing control. Air France Flight 11 is on final approach to Charles de Gaulle Airport. Once the landing checklist was complete, the first officer disconnected the autopilot and took control of the aircraft. But the thick fog over Paris had led to the first officer becoming slightly disorientated. And as soon as he began manually flying the aircraft, he started unconsciously tilting his control column to the left. The primary flight display, or PFD, showed the plane banking 6 degrees to the left. The first officer, not realizing that the plane was simply following his commands, expressed his confusion to the captain. The captain looked at his PFD and also sounded confused that the plane had veered off the flight path and was now banking 6 degrees to the left. It's unclear why the first officer did not realize he was the reason the plane had begun banking to the left. At an altitude of 1,100 feet, just seconds from touchdown, the crew carried out a go-around, assuming there was either a problem with the weather or worse, a problem with the aircraft. The first officer pushed the takeoff go-round button on the thrust levers, and the engines increased to near full thrust. The left roll got worse and reached 15 degrees. The first officer began pulling on his control column all the way back, trying to get the plane to climb. At this point, the captain had also grabbed his control column and was beginning to make his own series of inputs. The problem with this is that the captain failed to alert the first officer he was taking control of the aircraft with the standard call-out, "I have control," which is what all pilots are trained to do. This is to prevent situations like what is about to happen. As the nose was pitching up, the captain assumed this was because there was something wrong with the plane, but he was wrong. The plane was pitching up because the first officer thought he was still in sole control of the aircraft and was purposely pulling back on his control column, trying to execute the go-around. Both control columns are mechanically linked to move in sync. If one pilot applies X amount of force, the other would have to apply X amount of force plus even more force to overcome the inputs of the other pilot. The captain pushed his control column forwards, trying to stop the nose from pulling up, but he was actually pushing against the first officer's inputs. The two pilots basically began wrestling each other, each trying to counter the seemingly random movements from their control columns, not realizing these movements were inputs from the other pilots. At no point during this flight did the pilots think to communicate with each other or ask what the other pilot was doing. They were wrestling each other so hard, both pilots were putting down as much as 50 pounds of force, counteracting each other's movements. This led to the controls decoupling twice as a safety measure kicked in. This safety measure is in place just in case one control column is jammed. The other could be forcefully wrenched free. They do this by applying so much force the control column decouples from the other, allowing it to be used to fly the aircraft. The pilots were so focused fighting their control columns, they were doing things they didn't even mean to do. Another mistake the pilots made whilst wrestling with the controls is that one pilot accidentally pushed his push to talk button on the flight controls. airport controller heard the struggling pilots and attempted to ask them what the problem was.
Air France 0. Je vous rappelle.
As this was happening, another Air France flight was beginning to roll down the runway. Once they took off, they would be on a direct collision course with the struggling aircraft. Fearing the worst, the controller immediately alerted the taking off aircraft to stop its climb.
Air France Hotel Whiskey, stoppez la montée 15 centrée immédiatement.
However, the crew of Air France Flight 11 kept on accidentally pressing the push to talk button as their struggle continued, drowning out all ATC communication, and the controller back at Charles de Gaulle was worried that the taking off flight could not hear their command.
Air France Hotel Whiskey.
Realizing the situation was dire, the crew of Air France 11 hit the takeoff go-around switch a second time, pushing the engines to their maximum power. The plane rocketed into a steep climb, and finally, the first officer could call out positive climb and retract the landing gear. Even at this point, the two pilots were still making dual inputs. The master caution warning illuminated. It was the gear configuration warning. The plane was warning the pilots that it was too close to the ground with landing flaps selected, and thought that the pilots had forgotten to lower the landing gear. Now that there was a gap in ATC frequency, the flight that had just taken off confirmed that they had heard the controller's command. Once the plane in the sky was finally stabilized, and the captain was the sole person making inputs, the crew completed the go-round actions and raised the flaps to get rid of the alarm. The crew then contacted ATC to explain the problem and request a go-round.
Ok, France 011, on a remis les gaz, mais 4000 pieds, on va les maintenir, on vous rappelle. Pas de soucis 011, maintenez 4000 pieds, le QNH est à 1013, le départ en dessous est stoppé, vous me rappelez quand vous pouvez. Air France 011, on a remis les gaz, donc un problème de commande de vol, l'avion fait à peu près n'importe quoi, donc...
They were able to land with no further complications.